Every family has its secrets, or at least its defining tragedies, triumphs, or unions. My own family has a few that come to mind. One that has always delighted the sensationalist in me is the set of great-great-whatever grandparents from deep in the roots of my family tree, composed of a Spanish priest and a French nun. Just let that sink in for a moment. A nun and a priest, who didn't even speak the same language? Their hopelessly romantic, deeply lustful connection flashes across my mind, and I wonder who they really were, how they met, how long they knew each other, and what became of the child whose own children and grandchildren led toward my existence. Another is the story of my father's father, who passed away before I was born. My mother's father did as well, but his was a simpler story, old age, and a stroke. My father's father was a bit younger, maybe around 60 years old, and the first version of the story I heard was that he had died of a heart attack. That sounded simple enough, but as I grew from early childhood, the story took on more details. His life was lost when he went overboard on his lobster boat. For a number of years, I was confused as to whether he had died from a heart attack or drowning, until one night when I was in my late 20s. I was living in Utah with a husband and 2 small children, and my parents had come out from Maine to visit. My father was at the helm of my sturdy Volvo station wagon, deftly maneuvering the twisting, steep-graded Highway 6 that cuts a path through Utah's enormous mountains, connecting 2 canyons. It was springtime, but snow was spitting at that altitude. My mother was riding in the back, napping with my little boys who were asleep in their car seats. As we drove, my father told me stories of his past. He told me about driving cars onto frozen lakes and drinking lots of beer. He'd been a teetotaler for my whole life, so that one gave me a wicked delight. He told me about his first wife, a woman shrouded in mystery because she had disappeared decades before he married his third wife, my mother. He had sons with his second wife, a bird-like little woman who occasionally appeared at family picnics and who probably had a story of her own, but her presence muted my curiosity. My father's phantom first wife was the result of a classic last-minute wedding before shipping off to war. Only, my dad's Air Force command never got sent to Korea, just Newfoundland, and the timing of her pregnancy was impossible to reconcile with my father's leave-time visits. So their union dissolved around the 1-year mark. Before he turned 20, he was already divorced. I found myself riveted by the story of this first reckless choice of a wife, which caused the fires of jealousy and mistrust to grow within him. I was hanging on every word, soaking up the details that would fill in the void of a woman I'd always known existed, but had never known about. He moved on to stories about his brothers and stories about the Air Force. He chuckled a lot and shook his head at his own foolish youth even more. There were stories I didn't ask about, but somehow I dared to wonder aloud what had actually happened to his father. I listened in a hush, wishing for a voice recorder to preserve the tone of his voice and every detail of the story. Whenever I think about this story, the first image is of the dark, warm cocoon of my car, with snow flickering through the headlights as we wound our way back to the valley where I lived. Next, I see the wharf in Owl's Head, where my dad lobstered for most of my childhood. The dirt parking lot, the wooden pier with stacks of wire traps, the small harbor dotted with dozens of fishing boats, the tall masts of the pine trees lining the shore. I smell the slowly rotting herring in the bait barrels and hear the cries of the wheeling seagulls, sneaking in to steal the bait, steal a sandwich, steal anything they can. And then, as I settle on the memory of my grandfather's loss, the picture in my mind turns to shades of dark gray, the sky and the sea mirroring each other, broken occasionally by white-capped waves. A cold fog hangs low, skimming the top of the boat, impeding visibility in the wintry March air. The scene is silent, and all I see are the panic-stricken faces of my uncle, some young version of him I've created, and the grandfather whose face I only know from photographs. I see them flailing in the frigid March water, in turn and in tandem. First my uncle, in his 20s, a young father himself, overboard in his attempt to tie the boat to its mooring out in the harbor. Then my grandfather, reaching for his youngest son, offering his help, and instead joining his son in the ocean. Neither of them could swim. They each tried to save the other, in what must have felt like an endless moment in time, thrashing about, gasping for breath. They sought purchase on the high, boxy side of the lobster boat or the curved, low side of the rowboat. Eventually, my uncle was able to haul his water-heavy body over the side of the rowboat and reach back for his father, but it was too late. The combination of terror, cold, and latent heart disease had left him with a massive heart attack and unconsciousness, making him unable to assist in his own rescue. I have sat in stillness and pictured the aftermath of that day. My young uncle, usually the life of the party, lying on a bed in his mother's house, staring at the ceiling, too shocked to cry, shivering and hollow. I have pictured my father, newly married to my mother, receiving a long-distance call at their home in Los Angeles, and the devastation he must have felt. It was his boat they were moving that day, preparing it for his return to Maine and to lobstering. I picture my sweet, tough little Grammy hearing the news that her husband was gone and that her youngest son had almost been lost as well. I picture the younger versions of my whole clan, my Grammy with her 3 sons and their sons, all men of the sea. I picture their wives and daughters, who surely felt the shiver of fate run down their spines. Next time it could be my husband, my son. I picture the small, pretty cemetery on Ash Point and the gravestone I visited with his name on it that sits just across the peninsula from where he was lost. Of all the stories of loss in my family, this one has become the one I am most glad to know.